When we say the economy, what do we actually mean? We need to define this term before we start talking about the purpose of the economy in the next few classes. One way to think about this is to consider what happens in the economy. All economic activity starts with resources. This can be any kind of resources, natural resources like trees or oil, manufactured resources like tools or machines, human resources like physical strength or intelligence, and so on. We'll talk more about the different kinds of resources a little bit later in the course. We take those resources and we combine them to produce usable goods and services. So these are things like houses, food, clothing, haircuts, TV shows, and so on. Another way of describing this part of the process is to say that we turn inputs, the resources, into outputs, the usable goods and services. Next, we distribute those goods and services to the people who want them, and this can take two forms. Exchange means that a person has to give something, usually money, in exchange for a good or service. And this is usually what we think about when we think about the economy. So for example, if you go out and buy a pair of shoes, you have to pay money for it. That's an exchange. Transfer means that the good or service is just given to somebody without expecting anything in return. So for example, a public school provides free education services. Even though no money is handed over, that's still an economic activity. Finally, the goods and services are put to their final use by the person who has received them, and we call this consumption. Sometimes consumption means actually using something up, like when you eat or consume a meal. But some things can also be consumed by multiple people without depleting them, such as when people stay in a hotel room. That room is still available for somebody else to stay in the next night. Now, we said there's 4 economic activities, but there's actually only 3 in this diagram. So we also have to remember that resources themselves need to be maintained. So we can't just use them, we also have to make sure they're available for continued use into the future. So this can mean preserving resources, improving them, or even developing new resources. So resource maintenance includes, for example, replanting trees in a forest after you've logged it, or deciding to leave some oil in the ground for later, or investing in the education of a child to develop its human resources, its skills and intelligence, or maintaining a machine so that it keeps on working. Now these 4 activities, resource maintenance, production, distribution, and consumption, give us one way of understanding the economy. Any action that fits into one of these 4 activities is an economic activity. Another way to define the economy is to think about who does these economic activities. And usually the first thing that we think about is business. So businesses are firms that produce goods and services for sale at a price that earns them a profit. So earning a profit means you cover your costs and then you also have some earnings left over. Businesses can be owned by individuals or families, they can be corporations which have a legal existence of their own, or they can be cooperatively owned by their workers. The profit motive often means that businesses are quick to innovate, to adopt new technologies, and to reduce their costs by doing that or increase their output. And those things allow them to use resources more efficiently. Obviously, while making a profit is essential for businesses, it's the only way they can pay their owners and continue to exist, that doesn't necessarily rule out having other goals as well. So for example, besides making profit, a business might have the goal of providing good jobs, producing something that people genuinely need, or making charitable donations in their community. On the other hand, the profit motive can also sometimes cause businesses to do things that are good for their profit, but not so good for the rest of society. So for example, they might pay their workers poorly to save on costs, they might allow an unsafe working environment, or they might exploit the natural environment. Another important actor in the economy is the core sphere, which consists of households, families, and communities. And obviously one of the main roles of the core sphere is to consume what businesses produce. But the core sphere also maintains resources. So for example, families care for and educate their children, and many people maintain their own houses. The core sphere also produces lots of essential goods and services, such as household meals, vegetables from a garden, care for people who are mildly ill, entertainment activities like a games night among friends. Those activities are not motivated by profit. Distribution in the core sphere usually happens by transfer rather than exchange. If your mom cooks you supper, she usually doesn't make you pay for it. Instead, core sphere activities are motivated by either essential needs, people prepare meals because they need to eat, or by intrinsic enjoyment. Sometimes people prepare meals because they just like to cook. Most other economic activities would be impossible without the essential goods and services provided by the core sphere. One weakness of the core sphere is that it typically has limited resources. So for example, there's only so much you can do if your child is sick to care for them at home. Also, some people may not have the skills or resources to do what needs to be done, or tasks might be unequally divided among family members. Finally, there's the public purpose sphere, which is made up of government and other non-profit organizations, such as charities, religious organizations, international bodies, and so on. These entities all have some formal purpose that's related to the public good. So their goal is to make life better for some group or for all of society. One of the strengths of the public purpose sphere is that it has greater capacity than the core sphere to provide essential goods and services, things like healthcare, education, infrastructure, services like policing or fire protection. They have more funds and more power to make decisions, and so they have greater capacity to coordinate societal activities. Unlike the business sphere, goods and services produced by the public purpose sphere are often available to anyone, regardless of their ability to pay. Usually they're paid for by taxes or donations. So even if they do sell their goods and services, usually they set the price at a level that allows them to cover costs, but not make a profit. So for example, King's charges just enough in tuition to cover our operating costs. On the other hand, the lack of a profit motive can mean that the public purpose sphere is slow to innovate and inefficient compared to the business sphere. And compared to the core sphere, services provided by the public purpose sphere can be impersonal or can fail to meet individual needs. So each of the three spheres has an important role to play in the economy, and often specific goods or services are best provided by one of the spheres rather than the other two. So now we know a little bit about what the economy does and who does it. And the next step in defining the economy is to talk a little bit about the context in which all of that activity happens. So this diagram is called the contextual model of the economy. You can see the three spheres in the center, and those spheres are all engaged in the activities of resource maintenance, production, distribution, and consumption. But all of that activity happens also within a broader social context. So the social context includes history, politics, culture, ethics, and other human motivations. And all of those things affect the way in which we do economic activity. So for example, we have laws that govern how businesses are or are not allowed to use natural resources. People have ethical or moral reasons for believing that some types of goods should be sold and others should not, like pornography. Economic activity also affects the social context, so the effects go both ways. So for example, people who are well fed and have their essential needs taken care of by the economic sphere are more likely to be engaged in the social or political life of their community. Or businesses may try to change the government's mind about a particular law. Economic activity also happens within the context of the natural environment or the biosphere. All economic activity ultimately depends on inputs that come from the natural environment, things like fossil fuels, water, trees, soil, sunlight, and so on. All economic activity also produces wastes, such as chemicals that enter the air and water as pollution, or garbage that goes to a landfill. So it's important to remember that the environmental context is a closed loop. Within the biosphere, no new resources can enter except for sunlight, and no waste can exit. So that means that economic activity has to be kept within those natural limits. We'll talk more about the implications of that concept later. And because we're in Canada, there's actually one more context that we need to add to this model. That's the treaty context. So everyone who is in Canada who is not Indigenous, so who's not of First Nations, Métis, or Inuit descent, is a settler. A settler either immigrated here themselves or is a descendant of people who immigrated. So for example, I'm a settler because I'm descended from immigrants who came here from Holland after World War II. When the early settlers came here, they signed treaties with Indigenous people who had already lived here since time immemorial. So in Edmonton, for example, we're in Treaty 6 territory. The treaties say how settlers and Indigenous people can coexist respectfully and share the land. Through the treaties, settlers gained the right to live on the land and benefit from its resources. The treaties set aside certain areas of land, which we call reserves, for the exclusive use of Indigenous people. And Indigenous people also maintain rights to continue using their traditional lands, even outside the reserves, for activities like hunting, fishing, and gathering, and to receive certain services from the government. Because we, settlers, are still here, the treaties still apply, and they still play a role in many economic decisions. So for example, before allowing a new mine or dam to be built, the government has a duty to consult Indigenous communities who traditionally hunted or fished on that land. When the government is deciding how to allocate tax dollars to different activities, it has to include education and health services to Indigenous communities in its considerations. So we'll talk more about those issues as well later in the course.